Welcome to Tuesdays with Tom, a Precarious podcast series featuring exclusive insights from Tom Derry, CEO of the Institute for Supply Management. The topic of today's podcast is Macroeconomic Disruptors. Precarious founder Tanya Siri will discuss with Tom the Trump administration's NAFTA renegotiations and their effect on supply planning, trade wars with China, tariffs and what they mean for manufacturing, and practical advice on how to thrive in an atmosphere of uncertainty. Over to you, Tom and Tanya.
Tom, when ISM and Precarious first partnered, it was around the Big Ideas Summit. You may recall we had Nick Gowing, a very well-known BBC broadcaster who'd done some extensive research with senior leaders around the world. And his report on that research was called Thinking the Unthinkable. And his observation was that senior leadership around the world had had a catastrophic failure to address some of these black swan events that we've seen coming from left field over the last 10 years, or probably longer, but they seem to be coming with more intensity. And he's identified a real opportunity for middle management or senior leaders like the procurement and supply chain professionals that we work with to really step up and to anticipate these events, or at least be agile enough to respond. And he sort of talks about not becoming part of the frozen middle and really being there for solutions. So I think this is a real opportunity for our profession to be part of the solution when these black swan events occur. Now, these events can be any number of things, as you know, but what's very topical at the moment is obviously the trade wars, the new trade deals that are taking place. So if we could jump straight in, Tom, and talk about Trump and trade. We're obviously seeing a very drawn-out renegotiation of NAFTA. What effect is that having on the American supply management strategies and planning?
Well, what's really interesting about these kinds of policy changes is that even mere discussion has a real economic impact and causes real dislocation in supply chains. So even before the steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed, people reacted to the idea of tariffs, and that caused businesses to have to change their plans, for instance. And you have to understand the extent to which NAFTA has resulted in incredibly tightly integrated supply chains in certain industries. So, for instance, automotive being the most obvious example. We do a lot of assembly of vehicles in northern Mexico for final sale here in the United States, for instance, or in Canada. But before you get to final assembly in those plants, you've got components and parts that move across the U.S.-Mexican border 4 or 5 times before we get to the final vehicle, right? Imagine what it would be like now to have to impose tariffs on, in both directions 4 or 5 times, and the inspections that would have to go with it, and the country of origin verification that has to be performed. If NAFTA is not renegotiated, if it goes away in some fashion, it's going to be incredibly disruptive in terms of the economics of the auto industry here in North America. I mean, that is almost thinking the unthinkable kind of event. I would say too that I'm thinking back to the 2008-2009 recession. CPO that I know was working at LG Electronics back then, and they buy a lot of semiconductors. And he was aware of the sort of common wisdom that the Great Recession was going to drastically reduce consumer demand for technology products. Right? We're going to put off buying that next laptop or that next smartphone and wait a little while, and therefore the demand for semiconductor chips would dry up as well. And he wasn't sure about it, so he went over to Taiwan and talked to some of his suppliers, and they said, "Listen, our backlog of orders is so strong that we're going to be working for months just to work off our backlog. So no, as far as we're concerned, demand is persistent." He went back to the executive committee at LG and said, "Hey, listen, we're going to buy $9 billion worth of chips right now because the spot market price was down." And they looked at him with, like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Listen, no, this price is never going to be this low again." They swept all these chips into their manufacturing operations, And LG posted record profits in 2009, and people said, how did they do it? How did they figure it out? Well, it was because of the business acumen of understanding the spot market and chips and doing your homework. So this is how you respond to these thinking the unthinkable events. And that's a great example to me of how procurement saw through the sort of the common perception that people have and recognized the market opportunity and the dislocation between price and demand and seized it.
Great example of how we can turn, some of these perceived threats into a great opportunity and have a huge bottom line impact. Sort of going back to the macro perspective, the U.S. government seems to be fighting trade battles on several fronts at the moment, first with China and now members of the G7. What do ISM members think about these machinations?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. We publish these economic reports, as you know, Tanya, every month for the manufacturing and the services sector of the U.S. economy, and the comments have been very consistent. We're seeing suppliers trying to impose price increases on buyers if they're buying, metals like steel and aluminum, for instance. We're seeing people anticipating the tariffs, that we're looking to end sourcing from China and have to look for alternative suppliers elsewhere. We're definitely seeing people postpone investments. The two most important economic factors in deciding where to locate a manufacturing facility, for instance, are local taxes and tariffs. And if tariffs are uncertain, then we're going to postpone decisions about building that next facility, which is not good for the economy in the long run. And then the last thing that I have to point out is, in military conflicts, one of the outcomes that we most dread is those incidents of friendly fire, when you mistakenly fire on your own troops. And I think the current policy is almost an instance of self-inflicted friendly fire from an economic perspective. We might be helping domestic industries like steel and aluminum, although even that's arguable, but we're actually damaging the far bigger industries that are the consumers of that product. So you make household appliances, or you make yellow goods for construction, or you're making automobiles. All of our exports in those areas will suffer under these trade policies. So we're maybe doing more damage to ourselves than benefit to these kinds of maneuvers.
So with all this overlay of uncertainty, do you have any practical advice for the procurement and supply chain pros out there on how they can best seize the moment or stay agile? Are there any practical tips you can offer?
Well, every good category manager has got, strategy A for their expected economic conditions, and strategy B for what if there's an economic downturn or something happens in my commodity markets. You have to have those playbooks already thought through and scripted. So if you haven't done that, get to work on that immediately, because you will see a dramatic change and you need to be able to respond to it in the moment. The advantage goes to the company, the organization, the individual that can react fastest during times of great change. And those who have to kind of put their heads down and think it through and do the research, any benefit that is going to be realized is already going to be captured by someone else if you're late in moving. So make sure you've got that playbook well defined so you can respond and react to any scenario. I think be prepared, if you will, but that's the most important thing you can do.
If we try and, I wish we all had a crystal ball, but if we try and look forward, I guess a dramatic sort of macroeconomic event would be another global economic downturn. I don't expect you to have the crystal ball and predict that and when it will take place, but can you share with us some of the real effects on supply management in that scenario?
Yeah, and I think it's anticipatable anyway. I mean, if I did know when that was going to happen, I wouldn't be working anymore, right? But the economic expansion here in the United States is into its 100th month, I think, and it's the second longest on record. Now, it hasn't been a strong one, although it's been picking up steam here at the end. But it's predictable that it's going to come to an end at some point, and it could be that these trade issues might be the factor that tips us into recession here in the United States. We'll see. I think that at the moment the U.S. economy is quite strong. Inflation is definitely picking up. Consumer prices are about where the Fed wants them to be, right around the 2% range on an annualized basis. The price of oil is actually a very important factor macroeconomically, and it has a significant impact on the U.S. economy. You'd be surprised how many American households make decisions on how to spend their discretionary budget based on the cost of gasoline. You've got to get your pickup truck to the job site to get to work. Yeah, if I filled up yesterday, I spent $3.75 a gallon here in the United States. Fortunately for me, it doesn't concern me, but a lot of families will make decisions like, we're not going out to eat to dinner on Friday night, or we're not going to go to the movies, or we can't make that family road trip for vacation this summer. And so the price of oil actually is a big factor in how well the U.S. economy performs, because consumers actually account for about 2/3 of overall economic activity in the United States. So that's one we definitely have to keep our eyes on. It's right now, it's the price of a barrel of crude is somewhere around $70 right now. If it stays there, we're probably okay. If it goes much higher, that'll be great for the oil exporters like Russia and Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries, but it would definitely be a potential recession causer in the United States.
Well, thank you very much for the insights today, and particularly on the trade front. And I think the key message is really to understand the issues and have your plan A, B, and C. And thank you so much, Tom, for your insights once again, and I look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you for listening to our Tuesdays with Tom podcast, powered by Precurious and ISM. Stay tuned for more podcasts in this series, which will be made available for streaming in the learning area on precurious.com.